Ready?
Hit it!
Hello everyone and welcome to Twice Nightly the podcast with Maria Lovelady
And Michael Alan-Bailey, a podcast that aims to bring everything variety out of the wings and into the limelight.
So what are we waiting for?
Let's raise the curtain
And start the show! Coming up on today's show, we delve into the history of two forgotten variety theatre stars
We talk bird attacks in Brighton
and find out which unlikely household object Tallulah Bankhead used to hide her jewellery in. Oh, isn't it hot?
It is hot.
When you said stand by your fan,
Absolutely
then I automatically just wanted to go stand by your fan. Because the heat has made me delirious and it's made me daydream about Tammy Wynette.
Today is possibly the hottest day of the year so far. It is absolutely boiling, and me and Mike have to record this stuff today, and it's not ideal. But here we are. We've turned up anyway, and we are going for it.
We can listen back to this, can't we, in like winter when it's December and we're still putting these out. We can listen back to this one and reminisce about how lovely and hot it was.
I know. And as a little visual for you all, Mike is currently topless.
I had to do it, guys. I had to do it. I had to go topless.
So if that doesn't get your pulses racing, I don't know what else will.
So this week, we're going to dive straight into our chat with our fabulous guest, Alison Child. Now, the whole point of us starting this podcast in the first place was discovery, wasn't it? We wanted to discover. We wanted to discover new people. We wanted to discover new stories. That was what was really, really attractive to us. And I think Alison's book, Tell Me I'm Forgiven, is the epitome of that.
Absolutely. And this comes across in the interview, and Mike has spent endless hours laughing at me because of my enthusiasm when we are talking to Alison. I absolutely love this book. I love Alison, who wrote the book, and I love the special women in the book, their stories separately and their stories together, and this amazing cast, mainly of women, but and some men too, who were living, breathing, making a living from variety theatre, and people from all walks of life, with different talents, different backgrounds. It absolutely caught me up, this book. It feels more like a novel. You can't believe that this was real, that the plot twists were real, that this was actually their lives. I adored it.
So Alison's book, Tell Me I'm Forgiven, documents the life, the career, and the relationship between two variety performers, Gwen Farrar and Norah Blaney. Now, I don't want to give too much away here because Alison does such a brilliant job of explaining it herself. So let's dive straight in now and hear from Alison Child. So, Alison, we would like to start by asking you, how has the variety of theatre spiced up your life?
Oh my goodness. Well, I can remember going to pantomimes, and my dad worked at the BBC, so I used to get taken to all sorts of recordings and things. And I'd been taken to see, I think, a Noel Coward thing. Cavalcade or something, not the original production. But, and apparently I turned to my parents and said, I want to be a singing actress.
Oh, marvellous. Not just an actress,
So they
Alison.
never let me forget that.
A singing actress.
But then, of course, when I got into my teens and I was doing lots of youth theatre and loving it, and I'd fallen in love with theatre by that time, my parents started to say sensible things like, oh, well, actually, I think you should do a trainee as a bank manager. And, you know, they sort of started to get realistic for me. And I was like, but hold on, you've kind of hothoused me to be on the stage. And now suddenly you're saying this. How very dreary. But I went to university. I was in the Cambridge Footlights, so I went up to Edinburgh with them 2 years running and toured around the UK, some of the grand old theatres. And then after that, rather boringly, I trained as a teacher, but it was a nice fallback, and it's been a useful thing to be able to do. But then I sort of rediscovered my desire to perform about 8 years ago when I met my partner Rosie. She encouraged me to get back on stage, and we formed a little theatre company called Behind the Lines. And we've been back to Edinburgh 35 years on with her in a show that we wrote called All the Nice Girls, which was about performers in music hall, looking particularly at male impersonators, Ella Shields, Hetty King and Vesta Tilley. And while I was researching that, I discovered Gwen, Farrar and Norah Blaney.
Well, just before we cover who Gwen and Norah were, tell us a little bit about your experiences in Edinburgh. Did you notice a big difference from when you first went with Cambridge Footlights to when you went back with your theatre company all those years later?
That's a very good question. I think the first time I was there, I had quite a privileged time, really, because we had a great big theatre and everything was done sort of for us. And it sold out because it was Cambridge Footlights. And this time we had to get out there with everybody else and do the flyering. And we had a show which was about queer performers, but we didn't sell it that way because we wanted to have as diverse an audience as possible. So we would basically approach people and say, do you fancy coming and having a bit of a sing-along? So quite a lot of conventional type people came who weren't expecting to see a queer-themed show. And you could sort of see the colour draining from their faces in the first 5 minutes. But then they could see that this was a love story, so they bought into it. And by the end, you know, they were cheering along with everybody else. So
That's fantastic.
that was part of Behind the Lines' mission, really, to make queer work for non-queer identifying audiences and to make people just feel more at home with these stories and to recognise that they are as valid as anybody else's stories get told.
Absolutely. And how did it feel that you had to sort of disguise the fact that it was a queer performance?
Well, it felt like quite a clever sleight of hand on our part. It didn't feel like we were having to compromise it because when we were delivering the material, you know, there were no compromises there. There was one occasion when the show opened with me dressed as Vesta Tilley, really, singing a sort of recruiting song as a British soldier. The song went, jolly good luck to the girl who loves a soldier. Girls, have you been there? Girls, if you'd like to love a soldier, you can all love me. And I winked at a woman in the audience. And her husband went, right, come on, we're going. And I don't think she wanted to leave. I don't know whether I insulted his manhood, but they left and wanted their money back. And the management, and they were very good. And they said, no, you're welcome to go back in. But that was the only walkouts we had.
Which is not bad, I guess, in a whole
run.
season. So let's use that as a way of getting into Norah and Gwen, because they were living 100 years ago. You know, we're talking about something that happened to you and that a lady walked out of the audience because you're a woman winking at her as a woman. Here we are 100 years later and we're still facing some problems. And what I loved about the book, many things, as you know, is that this was 100 years ago. And yet it feels so modern, so fresh when you read the book, and almost more modern than now. So, shall we start at the beginning?
Yes. Yeah, I think it's because perhaps in those days a lot of the audience had a kind of naivety and about them and saw them just as two jolly good friends and how lovely. And so they worked on that level for a large section of the audience. But for the sort of in the know, the bright young things, the sophisticates of the 1920s, they understood very well what was going on. And I suppose that gave an extra level of interest to what they were doing and a double entendre, if you like, to their repertoire. Because they were singing the popular love songs of the day, but in a very camp way and very much addressed to each other. They were top-class musicians. So because of their utter professionalism, Norah as a pianist and Gwen as a cellist, they could sort of get away with a great deal because, you know, some people were there just to see them as classically trained performers, but performing this much more popular stuff. But there was something very, very polished about what they did and very, very camp. Gwen had this really deep,
Beautiful,
almost a baritone voice.
Yeah.
I mean, when you hear her for the first time, lots of people think that it must be a man. I think they worked almost fitting into the conventional duo category because of the contrast between them, and Norah definitely sort of played on the coquettish sort of femininity of it because they were completely unashamed about it. You know, audiences accepted them for who they were. I think they found them very unusual, but they loved them. They were hugely popular and they were household names in the 1920s.
So to draw on the parallels between your upbringing and your parents loving the show business and then trying to make you become a teacher and go down that path, it's a sort of similar story to the girls as well, in a way, because they were both, as you said, classically trained. Gwen was brought up in a very wealthy world and Norah's parents were more conservative. They both were classically trained, and definitely going into variety was not something that was on either of their parents' radar.
Not at all.
And yet they chose the variety path. Why do you think that was?
Well, absolutely. As you say, Nora's parents wanted her to be a concert pianist. She trained not only at the Royal College of Music, but she had a further 3 years at the Royal Academy of Music. Her father was a professional bassoon player, and I think they really saw her going down the classical path. But at the same time, I think she was taken to quite a lot of variety, panto type stuff, so she wasn't sort of kept completely away from that.
And I think, sorry to interrupt, I think we should also say that she was in London as
Yes.
well, which I think in terms
Yes.
of accessibility to the shows that were on, London was a great place to be.
Yeah, they didn't have an awful lot of money, but because of the dad's job in orchestras, they got sort of complimentary tickets to things. And Norah was an only child. She was sort of moonlighting because she was still at the Royal College and winning piano prizes, but then in the evening she'd go off and be in concert parties, and she was in summer season certainly, and she was very much the youngest, the sort of ingenue in that group. Gwen, on the other hand, yes, a completely different upbringing, very, very privileged. Her father, he was a multi-millionaire, was made a baronet by the British government, had 6 daughters. They were absolutely desperate for a son to carry on the baronetcy, and I think Gwen very much felt, she should have been a boy. She was a complete rebel. She said to her mum, if you insist on taking me to be presented at court and be a debutante, I'm going to do a handstand and then walk up to the dais like Charlie Chaplin. So.
And I think the stories that you get of Gwen throughout the book, you can absolutely believe that she would have done that.
Yeah, completely.
So you can understand why her mum didn't take her, because she would have done it.
Exactly. And she never was presented at court. She rode a horse up the steps to a debutante's ball, I think, just to sort of subvert the whole thing. She was so unapologetic too about herself. I think her dad boosted her up a lot, encouraged her as a kid, being a bit of what in those days might have been called a tomboy, It was a very open-air life in South Africa. They kind of spent their time between South Africa and a beautiful stately home near what is now Milton Keynes called Chichley Hall, which the family rented. She spent every year, big ocean crossings on ocean liners. And there was always an opportunity for the passengers to perform. And I think that was quite formative in Gwen's life. So she'd get her cello out and play the cello, but then she'd sort of send it up somehow and start playing it for laughs.
So do you think it's realistic, Alison, to say that it was the family's wealth probably contributed to the fact that she was able to be a little bit more herself?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if she'd had to make a living and put a roof over her own head, she probably would have ended up having to get married and conform. And she never had to do that because she had a private income.
Something that's also fabulous is that not only did she inherit that income, she earned that income.
Well, yes, she had 2 income streams. She managed to squander the lot, but no, not quite the lot. Not actually. That's not true, because she was very generous in her will to her sisters and to her friends at the end. But she did a lot of it went on brandy, I think, and other substances. Cartier gifts, necklaces, and cars. There were quite a lot of times when she was up before the magistrates for speeding in her car.
It did make me laugh, actually, because they're a double act and they sort of drove around to a lot of their venues together, which reminded me of me and Mike. And Mike drives everywhere and he does go rather fast.
I don't think I go that fast, Alison. There is a bit of white knuckling going on from Maria in the passenger seat.
And I was reading it thinking, oh my God,
That's
this is just me
us
and Mike.
two.
This is just me and Mike. They're trying to get to some theatre or another, and Gwen's got her foot on the pedal going as fast as she can, and Norah's in the passenger seat saying, slow down. We've got to this, we've covered their childhood and we know where they're at.
Yeah.
How did these two women come together to make their act?
Well, it was partly by chance. It was the First World War was on, and there were concert parties going out to entertain the troops. And they were largely pioneered by a suffragette and actress called Lena Ashwell. Gwen and Norah were hired separately to provide a classical staff. Gwen hadn't had a chance to blot her copybook by then. She was only about 17 when she went out, and Norah had been doing these concert parties. In fact, she was married. She married a fellow member of the concert party. So they were both what could be termed as highly respectable. They were on a bill with a musical comedienne called Wish Win, and the story goes that she liked to drop. And after a performance, they would be invited into the officers' mess for a meal. And Wish Win fell over in a ploughed field and broke her ankle.
Oh,
they were without a comedy act, so it was decided that Gwen and Norah, who had been engaging in quite a lot of banter since the beginning of the tour, that they should go on and entertain in a comedic way. And it really took off. It was basically Norah playing popular songs and Gwen kind of rolling her eyes and sending them up and doing dog howling noises and things. They played on a marvellous contrast between Gwen playing some beautiful classical piece and Norah accompanying her, and then suddenly jazzing it up, which of course the troops were utterly delighted by.
And in terms of the romance, do we know whether that happened before that moment or was it after that moment?
Norah pretty much describes, there's a quote in the book, if I may. Norah later recalled, Gwen and I took an immediate liking to one another and we chummed up from the moment we first met, adding, she was the girl with the most delicious sense of humour I have ever known. On the occasion of replacing Wish Win, the comedienne, she said that Gwen saved the situation and proved that she could not only play the cello but play the fool just as well. For after that, Gwen and I always played together.
Fabulous.
And so we know they created the act and they moved in together.
Yes.
In the fabulous house.
In 217 Kings Road, Chelsea, yes.
Which is definitely, if walls could speak,
Oh, I know.
if walls could speak,
Absolutely.
then that house would have a lot to say.
So this was
Certainly
the party
would.
house, wasn't it? This was the epitome
Yeah.
of the roaring 20s party house.
It really was, yes.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about, pretend you're the walls. What
Oh
would you
my
say?
goodness. Well, Gwen Farrar ended up living there for a long time. She didn't move out until the Second World War and the Blitz, when it was probably a good idea to shutter it up, really, and she moved somewhere smaller. So that's over 20 years, 25 years of seeing some extraordinary comings and goings. And in terms of the sort of lesbian milieu of the time, very famous author called Radcliffe Hall, who wrote an iconic and rather miserable lesbian novel called The Well of Loneliness. But it was a novel that the Home Secretary deemed was obscene, and copies ended up being burnt. Radcliffe Hall very bravely sort of stood her ground about it, but essentially she was absolutely dragged through the courts, and it was a complete stitch-up and a miscarriage of justice. I think she took some of Gwen Farrar's early childhood story as material for this novel, because it's about a very wealthy young woman who loves horses and who realises that she loves women. And the only scandal of the novel was that Radcliffe Hall changed the pronouns. So yes, you did have two women embracing and having a passionate affair. There's nothing explicit in the way that it's written. But really, the patriarchy, the establishment could not stand this, weren't going to countenance this at all, because it might give other women ideas.
To do everything that was happening in
Yeah,
King's
well,
Road.
yeah, exactly. So the King's Road, I digress. Yeah, the King's Road. I'd been there. I was so thrilled when I made contact with the current owners who've been there since the 70s. So they haven't changed it a great deal. You can still really, really imagine Gwen and Norah living there.
Yeah. And there's a lot of pictures in the book as well of the house.
There are, and Gwen used to draw. So she did these sketches of the house, and lovely scenes of domestic bliss with Norah at the piano and Gwen playing the cello and their little dogs. And
I think that's the thing that you get, is that they really had a life together. They were like a married couple.
They were. Actually, Norah was widowed by that time because that first husband had been killed in the First World War. But I can't imagine, I've tried to imagine what it would have been like if he had come back to claim Norah as his bride. I somehow think that they would have gone their separate ways anyway, because Norah and Gwen were very much of an item by then. So we know that Norah was definitely living there, even though the house was in Gwen's name. Mm-hmm. Norah tells a great story about when they moved in. Their next door neighbour was probably the most famous actress of the time, Dame Ellen Terry. And she came and gave them a terrific welcome. She didn't really know who they were, but she knew that they were a double act working in variety. She knocked on the door, and they weren't at all ready. They were in the middle of unpacking cases and looking scruffy and everything, but in she came, and they were completely overawed by her. But she said, I'm so thrilled that you've come to live next door. Dear Beatty and Babs. And Beatty and Babs were a sort of rival double act at the time. But
they were still quite young women at this point.
They were in their early 20s.
And they had these careers. They were settled down, in a sense. They owned their own property. Yes. Again, a wonderful story of the era, because that is not the image of women that we are usually presented with when we think of the 20s.
No, you think of sort of flapper girls, don't you? Mm-hmm. They were very much their own people and managing their own careers.
So let's move a little bit onto their careers. What were they up to at this point when they were living on King's Road?
Well, in 1919 they were appearing at the Colosseum on a bill with Vesta Tilley and with Diaghilev's dancers. A few months later they were at the Palladium with Ella Shields, the male impersonator. They were on a bill later on that year with Fred Barnes. Mm-hmm. Of course, who's just had a plaque unveiled to him in Maida Vale.
Yes, our avid listeners will know all about Fred Barnes.
I've liked to think that perhaps Gwen was influenced by him in her choice of repertoire, because she sang some solo songs which were similarly making fun of herself in a way that I suppose comics have always done, to draw attention to their own shortcomings before the audience do it, so that they get the laugh. And I think in a sense the sadness of it was that Gwen almost started to believe these things, although she was hugely self-confident and unapologetic about herself. I think that there was part of her which had absorbed the sort of internalised homophobia, if you like, and she started to drink a lot and almost in a way believe this negative narrative about her own peculiarness, if you like, as she saw it, as the world saw it, I suppose.
And I think that was from within her own family as well, because her mum was quite disapproving, and she wanted her to marry, but instead of marrying Gwen, she married Norah.
Well, exactly, yes. I mean, her mother was a bit of a social climber, really, and potentially, I think, as Lady Farrar saw it, Gwen was jeopardising her sister's prospects of marrying well and so on. And there's a marvellous writer called Beverly Nichols who eventually became well known for writing books about gardening and became a rather cosy sort of camp figure in the 1950s. But in the 1920s, he was one of the bright young things, writing very witty observations on what he saw. Beverly Nichols wrote a book called The Sweet and Twenties, where he looked back on the 1920s, and he said, disapproval of the music of the period was extended to some of its performers, in particular to a young lady with straight black hair, horn-rimmed glasses and square shoulders, who was called Gwen Farrar. Really, said the dowagers, there was no excuse for Gwen. After all, she was a lady, she was quite rich, and she had a delicious panelled house in Chelsea. She insisted on singing in public on the music hall stage with that young Norah Blaney at the piano. True, they drew the town. But somehow, when one remembered Gwen's dear father, who was a millionaire, it all seemed a great pity. Of course, he's being very satirical about it, but because he was a great friend of theirs. But and another of the queer friends who contributed to their careers, he wrote songs for them.
I was going to jump in and say that I'm thoroughly enjoying. I've just got to the part where we've introduced one of my favourite people, Alison, which is Tallulah Bankhead.
Ah, yes.
Tallulah Bankhead, the one and only Tallulah Bankhead.
Totally unique, amazing woman.
Completely.
Yes. So she took London by storm when she arrived. She was in a show called The Dancers, which had been written by the then most respected actor-director Gerald du Maurier, father of
Daphne du Maurier.
Daphne du Maurier.
Who are featured in the book a lot as well.
Yes, she does. Yes. So Tallulah was completely a sort of loose cannon, but amazing bisexual woman who had lovers.
And again, completely unabashed.
Completely unabashed, yeah.
She was so open about it, wasn't she?
Yes, completely. And there's just a list of amazing one-liners that she came up with.
Yeah.
Gwen's supposed to have sort of fallen for Tallulah. I think everybody who came in her orbit did. And serenaded her outside her window with her cello, singing "I Want My Tallulah Baby." And because I think it was just everybody fell for Tallulah, I don't think Norah minded at all. There were other relationships that Gwen had that Norah found much more threatening, but I think they were both under Tallulah's spell.
I love the story, if you can tell our listeners about the story with the bracelet and the teapot.
Yes, so I was really fortunate to find some actual interviews that Norah had done in the 1970s when she was in her late 70s with an actor called Derek Hunt, and he presented me with these fragile cassette tapes, and I managed to digitalise these interviews, and they're now in the British Library Sound Archive, I'm happy to say.
Oh, great.
Norah was very at home with Derek. They shared the same sort of camp humour, so she was quite candid about her stories. They didn't really trespass onto the area of her sexuality or the intimate details of her relationship with Gwen, but it's kind of all there in the subtext. So Norah says that Gwen had this infatuation with Tallulah. So the story goes that after Gwen's mother, Lady Farrar, had died, a great big string of pearls that Lady Farrar had was divided up into 6 sort of chokers, really, for each of her daughters, and they were rather beautiful. And Gwen put hers on, and Tallulah, who could be a bit outspoken, said, "Oh, you're so lucky having that pearl necklace, and it doesn't really look much good on you. Imagine how much better it would look on me. Look at you with your neck." And sounds horrid. Anyway, Gwen clearly wasn't too offended because she went to Cartier and ordered a beautiful necklace for her friend Tallulah, who had envied her one. And Norah knew. Norah said that she used to manage Gwen's finances, another little clue about the closeness of their relationship, and that she knew that Gwen really couldn't afford this necklace because she only got her allowance through so much every month, and it was going to make her overdrawn. So she knew that this necklace had to be returned to Cartier, and she teamed up with a fascinating character, Jo Carstairs. Jo Carstairs was a very butch lesbian with tattoos all up her arm, an adventurer, typical of Gwen and Tallulah's circle. Anyway, Norah and Jo Carstairs teamed up to go as burglars, and they broke into Tallulah's house and stole this necklace when she was out at the theatre. And Norah packaged it up in the case it had come in and took it back to Cartier and explained that really it needed to be returned, and Cartier were very good, and they said they would take it back and they would not send Miss Farrar a bill. Norah doesn't know whether or not Tallulah even noticed that this necklace had gone, but she never, luckily she never mentioned it to Gwen, and the issue never rose up again, but Norah had certainly saved the day on that occasion and prevented Gwen from going very, very overdrawn at the bank.
And did I have it right? Was it in the teapot?
Norah had done her research and asked Tallulah's dresser where Tallulah kept this necklace, and the dresser and she was a dresser come housekeeper, and she'd said, oh, Miss Blaney, yes, Tallulah keeps it in the teapot in the kitchen. So she knew when she broke in with Joe Carstairs, they knew exactly where to find this beautiful pearl necklace.
I just love
That's
that
a
Tallulah.
total, yeah,
just
just
was
kept a
having-
Cartier in the teapot.
Yeah, she just had Cartier in the teapot, and I think that just sort of sums up that group of people. Really.
Yes, absolutely.
We've got Noel Coward was at a lot of these parties
Yes.
with them. Gertrude Lawrence.
Yes, Beatrice Lilly was another great
yes.
character.
And royalty.
Yes, they were the absolute favourites of Bertie, which was the nickname of the eldest son of King George V, who went on to briefly become Edward VIII before he abdicated after he'd married Wallis Simpson. They were very much in his crowd at one point, and Norah was even supposed to have been sort of unofficially engaged to him because she wasn't afraid of playing to convention by getting married. So she'd been widowed in the First World War, but then she married again.
We've already mentioned that Gwen used to do a lot of drawings. There's a really interesting drawing of them both in a cab with Bertie that Gwen drew.
I know.
And it's Bertie, who later became king for a while, and Norah's on his knee, and Gwen is sat she's drawn herself with quite a face on her. She looks annoyed.
Yeah, she does.
That Norah is sat on the king's knee. And the fact that she drew that, it's so telling of the jealousy that she must have felt, even though she was going home with Norah. But as you said, Norah did, and it's quite throughout the book, and maybe it had something to do with her upbringing, and she didn't have the financial security that Gwen had. She did play to convention, and of course, if there's a prince, she
wanted to buy into that whole princess marriage fantasy. Yes,
absolutely.
I'm sure that would have been exactly what her parents would have been thrilled about. And when she finally married her third husband, who was a very well-respected surgeon in Bradford, that was certainly fulfilling, I think, the dreams of her parents, who were still alive. Her parents lived to a great age, so it wasn't until Norah herself was in her 50s that she sort of escaped parental expectations.
Norah's parents are quite a big presence in the book.
Yeah.
In that she didn't have the freedom, as you mentioned before, Mike, as Gwen, because she had to still she wanted to make them proud of her all her life. And as you said, then when she later on married again for the third time, she married a surgeon who saved her life.
I know.
And again, it's that fantasy, as we've just said, with the prince, isn't it? It's almost like playing the fantasy of this doctor's wife, and she became a bit of a lady in the area, didn't she?
Oh, she did. She lived in a really grand house. Yeah, I've been up there because it's now been divided into flats. But I was absolutely thrilled to hear from the resident of one of these flats, and he's done an amazing amount of research. He's called Philip Jones, and he and his wife have been so welcoming and lovely to us. And we did a launch event for when the book came out in 2019 and 2020. We did an event up there just outside Bradford, very close to where she lived. And she really had been the lady of the manor up there with Basil, her husband. But Gwen kept cropping up.
Yeah.
So that's something I did wonder throughout the book, because as you said, Gwen had many infatuations, and Norah married twice during this relationship, and yet they kept coming back to each other. The book is called Tell Me I'm Forgiven. Why do you think they couldn't keep away from each other no matter what happened?
I think it speaks to the sort of animal magnetism that was going on, and the professional respect they had for each other as musicians as well was a very powerful thing. And I think that initially that transcended the sort of class divide between them, because they had this language of music that they could communicate with sort of non-verbally almost. I like to imagine in the story, and I think it could well be true, that Gwen wooed Norah by her cello playing when they first meet on a train. And I'm certain that the music was a huge factor in bonding them, and they just had such fun together on stage and such an understanding of each other. You know, they could harmonise absolutely effortlessly. They could... understand and anticipate what they were each going to do. Norah talks about rehearsing with Gwen down the telephone.
Yeah.
I mean, we've just about sort of got a bit close to that these days with Zoom, haven't we? But even that's not without its hiccups when it comes to music and timing. But trying to imagine what it was like rehearsing on a kind of 1930s telephone line. But they managed to do it. And when Norah was in Panto in Sheffield, but going back into a show with Gwen in the West End that she'd left because she was under contract to Francis Laidler, this pantomime producer, they rehearsed the songs that they were going to bring into the show when Norah went back into it down the phone from Norah's hotel room in Sheffield.
This is an impossible question to ask, Alison, without rewriting history. But do you think that either of them would have reached their full potential had they never met? Or do you think they really needed each other to kind of strive?
I think meeting each other was the best thing that happened for both of them. Because together they had an act that set them quite apart from other female duos, which were often in those days called sister acts.
Yes.
And very often you would have two sisters performing on stage. But because they were so different in their personal presentation, Gwen with this deep voice and Norah with her lovely soprano at the keyboard and Gwen on the cello, I think that they were definitely, as the sum of the two was greater than the sort of individual components. Even that they were both hugely talented, but I'm quite sure Gwen wouldn't have reached the heights that she did without the double act. It was absolutely the making of her. And Norah had been working very, very hard to make a name for herself before she met Gwen, but it was only when they formed Blaney and Farrar that their careers took off like wildfire. She hadn't had anything like that success before.
And how did you come to learn about them, Alison? When did you discover them?
I came across a bit of YouTube footage that somebody had posted on YouTube, silent footage, of these two women who were clearly flirting with each other and performing for the camera, but also very focused on each other and touching each other's faces and just having a laugh. I really thought, wow, there's something going on here. So that's how I found them. And God bless whoever it was that posted that on YouTube, because I'm so glad I did. And then researching in numerous archives. The British Newspaper Archive online was very helpful, but I also went to the V&A at Blythe House and to the Cadbury Museum at Birmingham University. They had quite a lot of stuff. And even to New York to see if I could find out much about their very brief time on Broadway.
That's what I was actually just about to ask about, was they were in the Ziegfeld Follies.
They were, and it's very funny reading the reviews in the papers because they're described as sort of these British beauties, I think in the advance publicity, because that was before they'd been seen on stage, because they weren't no great beauties. They certainly weren't in the sort of homogenous lineup of high-kicking blondes.
Well, that's why I was really surprised when I was reading the book and it took this turn that they went to Ziegfeld Follies, because that is not what we imagine at all when you say those words.
Exactly, but they were there as a variety act in their own right, and very successful they were too. They went to Florida with the Ziegfeld show, and they were briefly in one in New York, but something
this is
happened.
The drama of the book.
Tell me I'm forgiven. That was going to take a lot on Norah's part to forgive Gwen what happened then.
And it was Gwen, wasn't it, that kind of put the kibosh on it, that decided
she just sort of, I think, slightly snobbishly decided that America wasn't for her and she wasn't fully appreciated there or something. I don't know why, because they'd got great reviews. But Norah, very tellingly, in one interview that was done when she was in Denville Hall, right towards the end of her life, Norah talks rather disparagingly about another actress called Audrey Carten, who she talks about as being like the third party. Not somebody like Tallulah, who Gwen was simply infatuated with, but somebody who proved, at that time at least, to be a real threat to their relationship.
This is where they parted ways and the act split up and they went on to have solo careers. And I think this was a part of the book that I really, really enjoyed, because it was seeing the variety world from a female perspective, which I feel like we don't get a lot.
No.
It's something that we haven't found so easy to find. And what I particularly enjoyed was that when this period was happening, they weren't young. anymore. They were around 30.
Yeah, they were definitely a bit older then.
Yeah, and I think, again, when we think of the 20s, history makes out that women were done by the time they were 30, and that, as we've just said with the Ziegfeld Follies, that they were all sort of 19-year-old blondes on stage. And yet Norah went on to was still playing Principal Boy in pantomime.
Well into her 30s.
Well into her 30s.
Yeah.
And I think that would be quite revolutionary now to cast a woman of that age in a leading young role. And I think that's a testament to their talent, how famous they were, the amount she was getting paid at the time to do that.
It was big bucks.
And I thought that was so fascinating, because it's completely not the history that we're normally fed about women in that time. And then, of course, Gwen went on to write her own material, which is not something that is remembered, but was happening. And she wrote that fantastic play that was really ahead of its time, where she wrote a court scene and she made all of the senior members of court women.
Absolutely. She played the judge. Everybody in the court were women, and they were making a judgment on a man who'd been to a football match. So it was all very silly, but very futuristic. It was set in the 1980s, really ahead of its time. They also played the Marx Brothers as women. It was a review which sadly sort of coincided with one of Noel Coward's greatest, wittiest, sharpest reviews and suffered by comparison. It was called After Dinner, and it really was ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
And I think that's the thing. I think we remember Noel Coward. Anyone who studies theatre knows he's one of the greats, and he deserves to be there. But what we don't hear is that there was a female lesbian writer that was writing a futuristic show about the 80s.
Yeah, and really sort of pioneering with it. Yes.
And it struck me, because when we wrote our show, Twice Nightly, there was a judge, and we made the decision to make it a female judge, even though in the time it wouldn't have been a woman.
No.
But as the cast, there was 3 of us on stage, 2 men and myself. We wanted another woman in the cast, so we thought, do you know what? We're just going to do it. And if anyone questions us about it, then we don't care.
Well, there you are.
And
Gwen really set that precedent for you.
And to find out, and people thought, oh well, you're not being accurate, and that was in 2021. And Gwen was doing it.
There's photographic evidence.
Yeah. And I that was so exciting for me. So why do you think that they are forgotten stars?
There's several answers to that. Just a really straightforward one that I think might be a factor is that neither of them had children to sort of carry their memory forward. I think a second reason might be that there definitely was a backlash against the Bright Young Things, and a backlash against their sense of entitlement, but also something of a backlash against the queerness that had been so evident in that time, and people became a bit more suspicious of non-conforming people. The public who had seen them as a sort of innocent pair of friends might have perhaps seen the queer side of their relationship and perhaps been offended by it and not liked it. And I think that's why they've been forgotten, really.
And also as well, nowadays, and as you go on through time, referencing to those people becomes more accessible, doesn't it? With now, everyone's got a phone, everyone's got a camera, everyone's got access to record these things. And it was more difficult back then, wasn't it? And because they weren't performers on film, or
not greatly on film, no. In fact, some of their most sort of outrageous stuff was filmed and looks very, very quirky indeed to the modern eye. There's a little bit of footage of them taking their bow at a cabaret called the Midnight Follies. And Gwen, I think it was typical of her behaviour on stage. I mean, she's so unexpected. She squats down and waddles like a duck across the stage, holding Norah's hand. Norah does a beautiful balletic curtsy, and Gwen bows straight forward in a very masculine way and walks sideways off stage at a 90-degree angle. I mean, it's so unusual. And I think, it's almost a case of if you had to be there kind of thing.
Yeah.
Gwen was in 3 films, 3 sort of Ealing comedies. Gwen was also in a film called Take a Chance, where she's in a very obvious kind of lesbian couple with a fellow actress called Binny Hale. Again, certainly it's not the sort of film that was being made in the 70s and 80s when I was growing up. It's really, when you look at it now, they're very sort of tweedy. They run a garage together and they're involved in a betting syndicate on horses. Well, you really have to watch this film, Take a Chance. I recommend it. It's been re-released quite recently on DVD. But certainly deeply, deeply unconventional Gwen Farrar in a way that, you didn't see when I was growing up, because in the sort of Benny Hill age, women were dumb blondes. It was only sort of when the wonderful Victoria Wood and French and Saunders came along that we really were presented with women who were funny in their own right and weren't stuck in these stereotypes that seemed to absolutely take root in the 50s and 60s.
Well, I think that's exactly why we're making the podcast, because I think people remember history in a certain way, or were taught it in a certain way. People decide for us who should be remembered and who are worthy of our time.
Absolutely.
And it takes people like you to be researching these books and writing this book, and then people like us who are trying to find out these stories and tell them, because they have been forgotten. And I can't tell you how much I love the book. It moved me, it made me laugh, it's so vivid. I felt like I was there. It's fulfilled my ambition of being a bright young thing, because I felt like I was one when I was reading the book. And I think hearing it from a female perspective and hearing it from a queer perspective as well, we're being retold these stories in a new way. For me, it was just so eye-opening, so fresh, and to read something that feels so modern and so alive, it was just beautiful, and I would just urge anybody to read the book.
Well, I can't tell you how much it makes my heart sing to hear you say that, Maria. That's absolutely brilliant, because what I set out to do was to put down the facts, if you like, of their story, because nobody had done that. They'd been completely ignored, and I didn't fictionalize any of it, so it's their story. They are there. I just felt like I acted as a medium for them to tell their story, and it's so good to know that it's connecting with a younger generation, and not just with the people whose lives overlapped with theirs, but with a whole new generation of people.
Alison, is it time for a Gwen Farrar and Norah Blaney film?
Definitely, or a TV.
A TV series.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many wonderful episodes. All the Tallulah stories.
Yes.
Nora's later life, which is fabulous. Gwen's upbringing. I'm not doing it in chronological order here, but you could create a fantastic Netflix mini series, I think, out of this, or even a maxi series.
Well, just to touch on the Nora's later career, which really was so interesting to me, because I'm such a Shakespeare fan, that once Gwen had passed away, spoiler everybody, sorry, that she then, and her husband passed away, she had to forge her own career because she didn't have the money, she needed to work, and she was very humble in keeping going, even though she was being told, no, you're a star, you're a
has-been,
you're a has-been, you're an older woman, what can you do, and oh God, people just thinking she was past it, and that she then got this season with the RSC.
So she was in the season with Vanessa Redgrave, with Diana Rigg, with Judi Dench.
Yeah.
And she played one of the witches in Macbeth. She was a Mistress Overdone in Measure for Measure.
Which I just think is fabulous, because for those that you don't know, Mistress Overdone is a pimp. And she is a real bawdy character, one of Shakespeare's fantastic feisty women, breaking all of the rules. And I think when you read the story of, as we've said, of Norah being confined to playing the very feminine ingenue role all her life, against Gwen, in making sure that her parents saw her in a certain way, and that her husband's, because she had to marry for society's sake. When they all passed away,
she could break out of that.
She absolutely broke out, and she, was at the RSC, and she was the leader of all these actresses who are now our dame generation of actresses that, you know, I aspire to even be like for a day. She was their inspiration. And there's an amazing quote from Diana Rigg saying, "I shared a dressing room with Norah and I adored her. We were the most unlikely duo to share youth and age. Norah flashed a large diamond ring one day and said, 'Be sure to get one of these for yourself.' It was the only advice she gave me and I failed to follow it."
We love that quote.
Again,
We love that quote.
Just an absolute another feisty feminine woman.
I know, she's amazing.
And I think it's just really important to me, because it's that cyclical nature that we adore Diana Rigg and we adore Judi Dench and Vanessa Redgrave, and we kind of see them as this generation of firsts because, you know, they were working with Peter Hall and at a really exciting time of the RSC, but Norah was there working also.
I know, in her 70s.
She was the pro.
Well.
And she was the pro. And it's this thing that, you know, there's always a new generation and there's always an older generation, and we kind of look back at, you know, at grandparents and think, oh, it must have been like this, it must have been like that, and actually
they pass the baton on from generation to generation. Yeah.
So I love that. That to me was a really inspiring end of the story. And then of course she was in Crossroads.
I was just going to say it must have.
Let's not forget.
Let's not forget. But I mean, do you find it frustrating, Alison, that you will talk to some people and they'll say, "Oh yeah, Norah Blaney from Crossroads," instead of this whole rich history that she had?
Yeah, I mean, she didn't have a major role in Crossroads, but...
well, she was picked out by the reviewers, wasn't she, as being a particular highlight of
on
Crossroads?
That particular review, yes, she was. So and then she was also in Within These Walls, which you won't remember.
Oh, I know, Googie Withers, the great Googie Withers. The original Bad Girls in Cell Block H.
I managed to get those on DVD, and she's in there, and there's a bit where Norah has to sort of mop the floor, and she's obviously been told to sort of hum, and she sings one of her classic songs. And Irving Berlin, she's mopping the floor and humming, but she's singing.
Can you get these on DVD?
Yeah, you can.
I'm getting straight on Amazon when I leave. Getting the Within These Walls. Getting on Within These Walls DVDs. Absolutely.
So we've talked a lot about these two fantastic performers, but we know that you're a performer yourself and you have your own fabulous career in your own right. So just quickly, could you tell us definitely tell us. No, Maria, I'm not going to do it.
If you don't want to tell us, Alison, you don't have to tell us. We're not going to force you.
Could you tell us what's one of your favourite theatres?
Okay, I think because of the Gwen and Norah connection, I'm going to say the Victoria Palace. It's just like this beautiful, and it's now been restored, hasn't it, recently for Hamilton. And it's just a little gem there, sitting outside Victoria Station. Beautiful, sort of white, like a gorgeous little wedding cake. And it's one of the first places that Norah performed as a solo artist, probably as long ago as 1918. I went to see Hamilton there, which of course I absolutely loved, but I was thinking about Norah on the stage there, and Gwen and Norah later on, because they played there too. And the Victoria Palace.
So, Alison, talent aside, if you could be a variety performer of any description, what talent would you like to have? Would you like to have been a magician? Would you have liked to have been a juggler? What is your pent-up pipe dream that you think, that's the skill that got away?
The top hat and tails and the Burlington Bertie.
Of course.
No doubt about it.
I'd like to know, actually, this is kind of off topic. RuPaul's Drag Race has really brought back drag in not mainstream, but it's out there and it's entertainment on BBC, and
it's for the masses, isn't it?
Yeah, there's male drag queens are everywhere. They're very in vogue, but we don't see many female male impersonators. on TV, and yet we know in this period, you know, they were really...
They were hugely famous, the three I've mentioned. I do have to give a shout out to some of the drag kings that are on the scene now, and I wish they had the profile of RuPaul's Drag Race, which I love. But there's Adam All, who is a fabulous performer, and he and his partner Apple set up Boy Box, which my partner Rosie and I have had the honour of performing at in the last 10 years or so, 8 years or so. And that's started off at She Bar in Soho, but now they have a regular night at the Glory, which is a queer pub in North London. And Apple is actually in touring at the moment in the Dragatha Christie.
How fabulous!
I forget what it's called. It's been in.
I know exactly the one you mean. Yeah, I know exactly the one you mean.
With some of the RuPaul stars from the season 1. And a fabulous actor in that called Louis Cypher, a queer performer, who plays a Tory MP. Might even be the Tory MP for Uxbridge. I'm not sure. Or no, it's not quite as Boris a send up as that. But I haven't seen the show, but I've seen Louis Cypher's work, and they are wonderful drag artists.
Because we used to have, you know, it was in theatre, women playing men was quite common. And, you know, a lot of it, you know, even was down to just the fact that it was seeing women in breeches was quite exciting for the audience.
The principal boy thing.
Then we had the principal boys. I remember even being young myself, and there were many principal boys.
Yeah.
That's kind of completely
gone.
That's such a shame. I know. I think it's a real loss to Panto, because I remember principal boys. And
and yet the male, the dame is
very still there. Is still there.
And often the celebrity role.
Yeah,
So-
no, I agree. It's a great shame, the demise of the principal boy. We need to see.
We
them
need to
back
bring
again.
that back. Well, it sounds like you've given
Yeah.
us some great people to talk to on one of our next episodes.
Oh, Adam,
No,
get in touch with them. Yeah, brilliant. And Louis
Yeah.
Cypher.
Yes.
And of course, we did have a shout out to Victoria Scone, who started season 2, didn't they? Or is it now season 3?
Yeah.
Isn't it, of RuPaul? Who is like a bio drag queen, and she's been really, really a first on there, and sadly had to drop out due to an injury. But
I didn't know that.
definitely a great artist on the drag scene as well.
So we usually end doing a this or that, so quick fire round. So
I'm going to be cruel. And start off. First one, Alison. Brighton or Greece?
All that stuff has got to be Lesbos, specifically the Greek island of Lesbos, Sappho's birthplace.
Perfect.
A lot of women from Brighton out there already, actually. So.
It's the Brighton of Greece.
It's the sunshine, yeah.
music hall or variety?
Ooh. Well, can I throw another one in there and say intimate review?
Oh, lovely. We do like a curveball.
Okay.
I mean, there's an obvious one, but that's really cruel, isn't it?
No, do it.
Gwen or Norah?
Yeah.
Oh, how could you? I should have seen that coming. Oh, it's impossible. If I had to be someone, I'd like to be Norah, but if I would like to have been in a relationship with somebody, it would be Gwen, so that would be perfect. I could be
There
Norah
we go.
in a relationship with Gwen.
Oh, I think I flicked back and two throughout who was my favourite. I think maybe you'd go for them for different things.
Yes, definitely. So
Things
different.
on different days.
Yeah.
Would you rather be sat in the audience or waiting in the wings?
Oh, that's an excellent question. Waiting in the wings. My mum loves opera, and I've always thought opera will look so much fun to do and isn't that much fun to sit in the audience. So I know that's a terribly Philistine thing to say, but that's, yeah, definitely waiting in the wings.
So, off stage quickly to change from Burlington Bertie into Maria Callas.
Yeah,
And then you come out and
that'll
sing
do.
opera. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a fabulous way to end the podcast. So thank you so much for giving us your time. It was wonderful to speak to you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting us to your lovely home as well.
Not at all.
And for the lovely Earl Grey, Alison. Never goes
I think we'll have to
unappreciated.
put the kettle on again now, won't we?
I think so.
Definitely.
Well, what an interview. What a life they had. And I really, really enjoyed the book as well. I feel like I have to say that because Maria completely top trumped me in fangirling in this episode. So I feel like I've just got to say as well, I did like the book as well, but obviously Maria took it to another level.
There was just something about it that I absolutely was invested in. I felt like I knew
No,
them.
no, you said.
Oh,
No, you said.
Did I?
No,
really?
I know. You said. You mentioned it a
Really?
couple of times. You mentioned it a couple of times.
And we were so lucky, weren't we? Because Alison then gave us signed copies of the book with a little note in to each of us. It was a couple of weeks before we were going to the Royal Variety Show.
Mm-hmm.
And so she wrote us a little note about that. And it just was gorgeous, wasn't it? It was a beautiful day. In fact, we'll show you those on social media.
Do you know, I don't think we always sort of mention, or we don't give enough of a shout out to the fact that the people that we speak to are always so welcoming. I mean, Alison invited us to her home. She looked after us, endless cups of tea. We were just treated so well. And that's something that for the listeners, you know, we don't always highlight that, but for us, it's such a special part of doing what we do.
And not just Alison as well. We got to meet her dogs and her wonderful partner, Rosie. It was just a gorgeous day all round, and we're so happy that we were able to share it with you.
And go back a little bit on our Instagram and you will see another really good friend that we met the day that we were in Brighton.
Yeah, so our avid listeners will already know this story. So go back as well and listen to the story of the seagull, because I got attacked by a seagull in Brighton.
Maria had a full-on Tippi Hedren moment.
But I don't think I was quite as graceful.
If you've enjoyed the show today, please be sure to give us a 5-star rating or leave us a review on whichever podcast platform that you're listening on. We're always happy to hear from you guys. So please get in touch on any of our social media platforms. We've got Facebook, just search Twice Nightly the Podcast, Instagram at Twice Nightly Theatre Podcast, Twitter at Twice Nightly Pod, TikTok at Twice Nightly Podcast, or you can search for us on YouTube, Twice Nightly the Podcast, to find all of our episodes and all of the episodes from series 1.
Do you think the podcast's called Twice Nightly the Podcast?
I think it's probably called Twice Nightly the Podcast. But if that wasn't enough, if you're all social media'd out and you've searched Twice Nightly the Podcast on every available social media platform you can, we've also got SpeakPipe. Log on to www.speakpipe.com/ you guessed it, Twice Nightly the Podcast. Don't type in, you guessed it, just Twice Nightly the Podcast. And this is a great way for you guys to leave us a voice message about any of the episodes that you've heard, anything that you want to say, any commentary you want to give, any feedback, or any questions for any of our upcoming guests.
All that's left for us to say is...
see you next week. We're having a heat wave, a tropical heat wave.